The drive home at 8:30 p.m. was anything but calm. George was livid, muttering under his breath and yelling at other drivers for their mistakes, no matter how minor. He cursed out anyone who didn't follow his unspoken driving rules. When a street vendor approached his car at a red light, tapping on the window with a bag of snacks, George snapped. "Do I look like I need any of that?" he shouted, waving the vendor away with a scowl. The vendor grinned cheekily and responded, "Maybe I should call the guy who sells champagne for newlyweds?" George's face darkened as his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The vendor had noticed the faint traces of wedding decorations on the car. Earlier, George had ripped off the "Just Married" sign taped to the bumper in a fit of rage, shredding it into tiny pieces. "You idiot!" George barked, slamming his palm on the dashboard. For a moment, he seemed ready to throw the car into park and confront the vendor. But just then, the light turned green, and the sound of honking from the cars behind jolted him back. "God saved you," George muttered through gritted teeth as he floored the gas pedal. His frustration simmered as he glanced sideways at Emily, his new wife, sitting quietly in the passenger seat. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her stomach growling from hunger she dared not mention. The day had been a whirlwind, a rushed breakfast, a slice of wedding cake that nearly choked her, and a sip of champagne at the toast. That was all Emily had eaten, and now her hunger gnawed at her. She glanced at George, knowing better than to ask him to stop for food. His temper was unpredictable, and tonight, of all nights, she wasn't about to test it. One thing Emily had come to realize about her husband was his explosive temper, which often drove him to act impulsively and without reason. Whether he felt any remorse for his actions was something she neither knew nor cared to uncover. She found herself wondering what kind of newlyweds drove home at such an hour. Then again, her wedding had been anything but typical. It was a spectacle of scandals and drama, leaving the entire Mason family in turmoil, except for her, of course. She was now officially a part of the family, a thought that briefly brought a smile to her lips. Catching herself, she glanced at the man who was now her husband. Even now, she thought, he exuded an irresistible blend of devilish charm and rugged handsomeness, if such a combination were possible. The lips that had once captivated and seduced her in photographs were now set in a tight frown. She figured he must have eaten by now, which would explain how he managed to sustain his simmering anger. Her stomach growled with hunger. Not a single bite of the lavish dishes served at the wedding had passed her lips. She could only hope there would be something to eat at her new home, a place she had yet to set foot in for the first time. As Emily slept, her gown had shifted unknowingly, hanging loosely on her frame, while her hair cascaded messily around her face, freed from the pins that had once held it in place. George glanced at her, unable to ignore how serene she appeared in slumber. The tension and sorrow etched into her features earlier had softened, and with a pang of guilt, he realized his own role in that sadness. His gaze faltered, however, when he noticed how her gown had slipped, revealing a touch more of her cleavage. Her beauty was undeniable, an effortless allure that stirred something within him, despite his conflicted emotions. Frustrated with himself, he quickly turned away, chastising the unwelcome admiration for a woman he had vowed to resent. "She's supposed to be my wife," he told himself, attempting to rationalize his turmoil. But deep down, he knew it wasn't hatred he felt for her. It was anger at himself and at the circumstances that had brought them to this point. His family's manipulations, her quiet acceptance of them, it all felt like a betrayal. Was it fair to be angry at everyone? At his family? At Emily? He caught himself stumbling over her name for a moment. Emily. The thought lingered briefly before he exhaled deeply, forcing his attention back to the road ahead. The car veered onto a quieter street lined with rows of identical suburban houses. Most were single-story ranches, with a few two-story homes scattered here and there. Emily recognized the cookie-cutter layout of a planned neighborhood and figured they were close to George's house. He'd been noticeably quieter for the last few minutes, and his anger seemed to ebb as they approached home. It wasn't long before Emily stirred, slowly waking from her nap. The car came to a halt in front of a black gate. George honked several times, his frustration mounting with each unanswered sound. No one appeared to be responding, and his patience was thinning rapidly. Emily, too, felt the urge to curse the person who had failed to open the gate. She could feel the tension in the air as the car idled in front of the entrance. The silence and the delay were only adding fuel to George's already simmering anger. At that moment, a middle-aged man, dressed in a long, flowing robe, emerged through the small gate. He bowed slightly, muttered something under his breath, and then disappeared back inside to open the larger gate. The brief interaction did little to ease the tension, but it was enough to get the gate finally moving. George's impatience didn't lessen, but the man's quiet manner seemed to momentarily calm the storm of his anger. The fool! Always sleeping on duty. George muttered angrily, his frustration barely contained. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he waited for the gate to fully open, feeling the heat of his temper rising again. As soon as the car rolled into the compound, Emily's eyes began to take in everything around her. The unfamiliar surroundings, the neatly manicured lawns, and the quiet atmosphere of the place made her wonder what kind of life awaited her here. When the car finally came to a halt, George was out first, slamming the door with an audible thud. The force of it startled Emily, causing her to quickly gather the hem of her gown before opening her own door. As she stepped out, she saw the gateman already standing by their side, waiting expectantly. "Good evening, sir," the gateman greeted, his voice polite, though George didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, George pressed the lock button on his car keys and started walking toward the house, his steps quick and purposeful. The gateman turned his attention to Emily, offering her a friendly smile. Emily, still a little disoriented, smiled back and waved. It was clear to the gateman that something unusual was happening. The sight of a woman in a wedding gown alongside his employer, who was sharply dressed in a suit, was an unexpected and curious one. George had made sure to keep his wedding under wraps. His housekeepers didn't know, and neither did the neighbors. But then again, this neighborhood was one of those mind-your-business kinds, where personal matters were left undisturbed, a trait George appreciated more than most. "Mr. George, your wife is extremely beautiful," the gateman exclaimed, his voice filled with admiration. George, fumbling with the door, heard the compliment but didn't acknowledge it. "Why don't you stick to your business for once, John?" George shouted back, frustration evident in his voice as he entered the house. Emily, however, smiled at the gateman's words. "It's okay, thanks for the compliment," she replied kindly, then added, "What's your name?" "John, Ma," the gateman said, a sheepish smile spreading across his face. "John it is then." "See you tomorrow," Emily said as she turned to follow George inside. "Okay, madam," John responded, his voice warm. He watched her walk toward the door, before turning back to his room, beside the gate. He looked back at Emily's retreating figure several times, a smile on his face. He had a feeling he was going to like this new madam of his. Emily walked between the neatly trimmed shrubs leading to the door, the foliage forming a Y shape that pointed toward the front porch of the blue-painted bungalow. The landscaping was impeccably maintained, and she couldn't help but notice the spaciousness of the compound. To her left, a well-kept tennis court stretched out, with a basketball hoop nearby. "No wonder he looks fit," she thought, taking in the sight of the sporting amenities. To her right, a small swimming pool glistened under the evening sky, with a few chairs arranged around it. "That man sure likes to be comfortable," she mused. "Not bad," she said softly to herself. "I'll definitely need that," her voice trailing off as she imagined how nice it would be to relax in such a setting. She continued walking, having lingered a bit too long in her exploration of the yard. When Emily finally opened the door, what awaited her didn't exactly surprise her. The living room had the unmistakable aura of a bachelor's pad. It was dominated by shades of blue, dark blue couches, a blue curtain leading to the hallway, and light blue walls that gave the room a cool, almost sterile feel. In one corner, high-tech musical appliances stood, a testament to George's love for gadgets. The dining area was visible from where she stood, further solidifying her thoughts. "Typical male," she mused. With a soft sigh, she walked over and sank onto one of the couches, the cool fabric feeling soothing against her skin. "Home it is," she muttered dryly, kicking off her high heels and wincing as relief washed over her sore feet. Her entire body ached from the long, draining day. What a day indeed, she thought, closing her eyes for a moment. George was nowhere in sight, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Good, she thought to herself. She didn't feel like facing him right now. Slowly, she stretched out on the couch, the exhaustion from the wedding and the day's events catching up with her. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she was both tired and incredibly hungry. The pangs of hunger jolted her once more, and she sat up, suddenly wishing to see George, if only to beg for a meal. Her eyes drifted to the clock hanging just above the plasma television. 9:45, she thought in disbelief. And she was still in her wedding gown? This was worse than a nightmare. She almost exclaimed aloud in frustration. It felt like everything was happening all at once, no food, no comfort, and now, the realization that she had barely moved since entering the house. Just then, George walked in, looking freshly put together. He had clearly just showered, and the light jersey he wore clung to his body a little too perfectly. Emily felt a stirring deep in the pit of her stomach, a sensation she couldn't quite shake. For heaven's sake, Emily, she scolded herself silently. This man has treated you less than human, and you still feel this way for him? She mentally gave herself a sharp knock on the head, trying to push the conflicting emotions aside. George didn't even acknowledge Emily's presence as he entered the room. Without a word, he walked past her, casually grabbed the remote from a side table, and pressed a button. He then plopped down onto the chair opposite the television. The screen flickered to life, and within seconds, a wrestling match appeared. He tossed the remote onto a nearby chair, propped his legs up on the furniture, and became fully engrossed in the match, as if nothing else mattered in the room. Emily felt a wave of frustration rise within her as she sat there, staring at George. The silence between them was suffocating. Was he really so indifferent to her, so cold? The thought stung, but there was no sign from him that he even cared. His attention was fully absorbed in the wrestling match on the screen, a smile playing on his lips as he watched. It was then that Emily realized, if she wanted to get out of this suffocating gown, she would have to act. She couldn't wait for George to notice or make the first move, he seemed to have no intention of doing so. She glanced at him one more time, but he was lost in the match, perhaps unaware, or maybe just pretending not to notice. Whatever the case, Emily knew she had to take matters into her own hands. Emily's words hung in the air, calm yet firm, as she stood there, watching George. She had hoped for something more, something better, but the reality of her situation was sinking in. Her expectations had been shattered earlier that evening, and now, all she could do was speak her needs quietly, avoiding any hint of confrontation that might trigger his already volatile temper. "George, I need to freshen up, and I'm hungry," she said softly. She knew better than to raise her voice, aware that doing so might provoke his already volatile temper and make her situation even worse. George didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out for the remote and began pressing its buttons, with deliberate focus. Midway through his actions, he finally spoke. "Mrs. Mason," he drawled with unmistakable sarcasm, "the kitchen is right there, through the dining area, and the bedroom is down the hallway behind that curtain." He kept his attention fixed on the remote, pressing its buttons, without sparing Emily so much as a glance. "Besides," he added with a smirk, "since this is technically your home now, I expect you to figure it out yourself, just like you explored the exterior." With that, he placed the remote beside him, leaned back, and stretched out on the chair, his body language making it clear that the conversation was over. Emily remained silent, her thoughts swirling. So, he had noticed? This was the most he had spoken to her since the ordeal began a month ago. Then again, she mused bitterly, they hadn't truly known each other before the whole marriage debacle started. She quietly bent down, picked up her shoes, and walked away without a word, determined to begin her exploration. George remained motionless, though a storm brewed within him. His temper was on edge, and he struggled to rein it in. What was it about her that ignited such frustration? He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Dismissing the thought with a mental wave, he convinced himself it wasn't worth dwelling on. Emily's steps instinctively led her to the kitchen, her growling stomach urging her on. The sight that greeted her was both impressive and disheartening, a spotless, well-organized kitchen but not a morsel of prepared food in sight. Her eyes landed on an unopened bag of rice, but there were no other ingredients visible to make a meal. Besides, cooking at this hour, especially in her current attire, was out of the question. As she leaned against the counter, another realization struck her. What was she supposed to wear after bathing? All her belongings were still at the family house on Rosewood Lane. She sighed deeply, a mixture of frustration and resignation washing over her. This is going to be a long night, she thought, shaking her head. Thinking about her predicament, Emily wandered into the dining area. Her eyes immediately landed on a few beverages placed neatly on the table. A pang of regret hit her as she recalled the moment on the road when she could have insisted George buy that bag of snacks. It would have made all the difference now, she thought wistfully. But there was no use lamenting. At least there was something to sustain her. Grateful for the small mercy, she prepared herself a cold cup of tea, sipping it slowly as she felt a sliver of energy return. Once she was done, she set the empty cup aside and decided it was time to explore the hallway and figure out her next move. The hallway was dimly lit, with 4 doors in total, 2 on each side. Emily wondered which one led to the bedroom. Well, he did say to explore, she thought. And explore, she would. She first tried the door to her left, but it was locked. Can't be this one, she muttered. Moving to the opposite door on the right, she turned the handle, and the door opened quietly. Peering inside, she quickly recognized it as the bedroom. Quick luck, she thought, stepping in. The room was simple but neat, with white painted walls and a large bed dominating the center. A large mirror stood nearby, and just a few steps away, there was a wardrobe. The space was immaculately tidy, just like the rest of the house. He must be a neat freak, Emily mused. A few minutes later, Emily emerged from the adjoining bathroom, wrapped in a towel that barely covered her. It was all she could find. The problem of what to wear returned with full force. She glanced at the discarded wedding gown in disgust. Not going to wear that, she muttered to herself, before heading straight for the wardrobe to continue her exploration. A few minutes later, Emily was dressed in George's oversized t-shirt, strolling down the hallway toward the parlor. Chantel's "Nothing But Your T-Shirt On" played in her mind, and she couldn't help but hum along. Despite her situation, the song felt like a perfect reflection of how she felt. She was completely naked under the shirt, but somehow, it made her feel surprisingly good. The faint scent of George's perfume lingered on the fabric, calming her nerves, and she realized she might actually be feeling a little sexy. This thought made her smile. Emily had always been a sucker for music. She didn't just love the rhythm, she paid close attention to the lyrics and often found a way to relate them to her own life. Each song, she believed, spoke to some experience or emotion, and knowing when to apply it could soothe the soul. Her deep love for music had once made her mother tease her, asking why she wanted to pursue nursing instead of a career in music. That was long ago, before her mother passed away. Emily stood in the dimly lit parlor, the soft glow from the windows providing faint illumination. George was asleep, his quiet snores filling the room as he lounged in the larger chair. The television was off. So, he even snores, she whispered to herself, a soft giggle escaping her lips. Behind all that handsomeness. She smiled as she walked toward the kitchen. In the kitchen, she paused for a moment, unsure of why she had come. Then it hit her, juice. She was craving juice. Without wasting time, she opened the fridge door. Nothing. Just a few cans of Budweiser beer. She glanced around, her eyes moving to the cupboard above. She searched frantically, but deep down, she knew it was pointless. Who kept juice in the cupboard? She thought with a resigned sigh. The light feeling she'd had earlier was now gone, replaced by frustration. The night, which had briefly seemed promising, was quickly spiraling downward. Emily leaned against the counter, a tear slipping down her cheek. This was the last straw. How was she going to survive the night without her juice? Her mom had called it juice craziness. Emily had never skipped it, and the consequences were always dire. But tonight, on her wedding night of all nights, she had to. She felt sorry for herself, hating how love had clouded her judgment. As she walked past George's sleeping form, heading to the bedroom, she wished no one she knew would ever take the kind of foolish gamble on love that she had.